Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Nadja Taeger, and in the name of GIZ, together with the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport, I would like to welcome you all to our webinar on enhancing climate emission in transport. We are very, very glad that you joined us today. I am a policy advisor at GIZ's transport team, and I will moderate today's session. We will record the webinar and put it up online later. We will also provide Spanish subtitles to it. For the sake of a good internet connection, our webcams will be switched off most of the time. Before we start, let's quickly touch upon the most important features of the webinar software. You see the control panel. If you click the button next to the number 1, you can hide the panel. And if you click the button next to 2, you can see the webinar in full screen. If you click the globe symbol, you can change the language of the panel. To make sure everything runs as smoothly as possible, participants are auto-muted during the webinar. But you can always post your questions and comments in the questions pane. We will either respond to them directly or collect them for a Q&A session in the end. The webinar will take about 1 hour. We'll start with a short introduction and overview of transport and NDCs. And then Marion Vivek will give a presentation on the 6 action recommendations for policymakers to align transport with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Agenda. And afterwards, Mark Major from SlowCats will give us an overview of transport and NDCs in 2020. In particular, we'll hear about a new NDC database and analysis. Also, I'm very happy to announce that this webinar will serve as a kickoff to SlowCats' advocacy campaign. In the end, there will be room for your questions and comments. Before we start with the presentations, I would like to give you a short overview of who will be presenting today. Marion Vivek is a senior consultant who focuses on energy, transport, and climate strategies. She's one of the co-authors of the study on the 6 action recommendations. And Mark is a transport expert and works as a senior advisor for the Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport that is also called SlowCat. And also with us from SlowCat here today is Nicola Midimurek. He's a senior researcher and responsible for SlowCat's Transport and Climate Change Global Status Report. He'll be supporting us today in answering your questions. And then there's me, I already introduced myself. Now let's dive right into an overview of transport and NDCs. As most of you will be aware, the global demand for transport is growing dramatically, especially in developing and emerging countries. By 2035, the vehicle fleet is expected to double to 1.7 billion vehicles. So more kilometers with more vehicles will result in more traffic, higher energy consumption, and therefore higher CO2 emissions. Already today, transport emissions that primarily involve road, rail, air, and marine transportation account for over 24% of global energy-related CO2 emissions, or around 8 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. And since emissions of the transport sector are growing at a faster rate than in any other sector, it is possible that without determined action, they could amount to over 20 gigatons by 2050. So what do we do about that? Well, as I'm sure most of you are aware, in 2015 at COP21, the member parties to the UNFCCC reached a landmark agreement to combat climate change, the Paris Agreement, as we all know. It sets the international framework to reduce emissions, with the aim of keeping global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And a very important vehicle for the achievement of the Paris Agreement targets are the so-called nationally determined contributions. The NDCs communicate what each country intends to achieve in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing resilience. They must be submitted in a 5-year cycle, with a second generation due this year, in 2020. And as I've shown you before, transport plays a major role in limiting global warming and combating climate change. For transport, the Paris Agreement targets essentially mean decarbonization by mid-century. And that's a 75% reduction compared to today's levels. And here on this slide, and this simplified illustration, you can see what could happen if we do not take determined action in transport. It would not be possible to hit the 2 degrees target, let alone the 1.5 degrees target, if we do not take emissions reductions from transport seriously and step up action now. So we asked ourselves already a while ago, what is the contribution of transport in the NDCs? There are 2 studies on that question. The first one came out shortly after COP21. It was done by SlowCat, and they analyzed transport commitments in the NDCs. And in 2017, we at GIZ did an updated review on the representation of transport in NDCs. Both analyses confirmed that many countries have acknowledged the importance of the transport sector for achieving national emission reduction targets, but that much more needs to be done. Here you see a map from the GIZ analysis. As you can see in the first round of NDCs that were submitted before 2020, transport was identified as an important sector in almost 90% of NDCs. And all the dark green colored countries included transport mitigation measures in their NDCs. However, only 14 NDCs actually had set quantified reduction targets for transport. Those are the blue colored countries. So while most countries mention transport in their NDCs, very, very few draw on the full range of available solutions and formulate explicit transport targets. And the analysis done by Slowcats also shows that transport-related actions in the NDCs are heavily skewed towards passenger transport, while only very few take the freight sector into account. Also, the subsectors are not very evenly covered. The low-carbon options, such as walking and cycling, are only represented in 14% of NDCs. So overall, the analyses show that transport mitigation measures proposed in the last NDCs fall short of a 2-degree pathway. We need to enhance ambition to achieve deeper emission cuts that would put transport on track. And this year is therefore key for enhancing the role of transport in NDCs, since now the next round of NDCs is due for submission. To support policymakers and other officials working on climate action and transport and formulating concrete measures, we have come up with 6 action recommendations. You see here the study and the link, the QR code to it, where you can download it, but you can also download it in the webinar directly under material. The study is a result of a detailed study of existing transport-related papers, research findings, calls for actions, and roadmaps. And now I would like to hand over to Marion, who will tell us more about the findings of the study.
Thanks a lot, Nadja. Hello, everybody. I'm just showing the video very quickly and briefly to make it so you know who's talking, but I'll turn it off right away to ensure bandwidth is enough for everybody who's joined, maybe also in places with less stable internet. So I want to talk about the new study, the 6 action recommendations for policymakers. And while the starting point for our analysis was the NDCs, we were trying to look much more broadly into what needs to happen in the transport sector to make it compatible with the Paris Agreement objectives, but also the Sustainable Development Agenda. Somehow I can't seem to move the slides. Nadja, I can't move the slides. Oh, no. So what we observed is that there is a mismatch between the different communities. We have those working on climate, and we have those working on transport, and there's a relatively small overlap between those communities, and they have different objectives. And a lot of what is happening in the transport community is also actually quite counterproductive in terms of emissions and greenhouse gas effects. What we try to do is to bring those 2 communities together. Nadja, I still can't move the slides. to bring those two communities together to achieve a more sustainable development in the sector. And that does not only relate to the NDCs. That is very important. It also relates to low carbon development strategies, but also outside of the climate sphere to national development plans in general, transport strategies either at a national or a subnational level, and also, as mentioned, the SDG implementation. So that is really, we tried to look at this in a very overall integrated way. From looking at the climate perspective, we see that we have two different elements of what needs to happen. We need to have a transition in the way we are mobile. So what kinds of modes we use, how much we actually travel. So we need to change our travel patterns, but that will not get us to where we need to be to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. We also have energy solutions that are very much revolving around the vehicles and the fuels that we use. But also if we concentrate only on those, we will not get to where we need to be. And this graph illustrates that we need both of those. And there is some so we can have different focus, but and each country will have a different focus depending on their national circumstances, but everybody will need to look at both sides of the equation to be able to achieve drastic emission reductions. But also what we want to keep in focus is that it's not only about greenhouse gas emission reductions, we also look at the broader sustainable development. And also the benefits of many of those actions that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that also address many of the general sustainable development goals that were set. So we have the 17 sustainable development goals, and actually 7 out of those 17 somehow relate to transport, and we can a lot of the measures that we're looking at in the transport sector will help to address those, and that relate to access for broader sets of the population. It relates to health and safety of the population in terms of accidents, but also air pollution, for example. Also ensuring resilient infrastructure, we'll get to that in the recommendations in terms of changes also in climate, and also related to in energy efficiency in general. So many of the actions that we're looking at will have multiple benefits, but it's really essential that we look at them in a coordinated way. So, oops, that was one too fast. So we're looking now at we have 6 recommendations, and for each of those recommendations, we've looked at a set of issues. First, we tried to define what do we actually want to achieve? What is the objective of this action? Then we looked at what are milestones that we need to achieve within those objectives that are in line with the Paris Agreement objectives. And then we looked more at how can you then put this in practice. So what are policies and instruments that you can put in place? What are the who are the stakeholders that you need to involve? to make this happen. And we also looked at, for some of the recommendations, what are technologies that might be game changers, and that we need to be aware of when we're designing and planning policies. So in the report, we look at each of those elements separately, and I won't go into too much detail here, but that's all in the report. So the first recommendation is that we need to shift the mobility paradigm towards zero carbon targets for 2050. And what does that exactly mean? What we want to convey here is that we need a complete change of mindset. So we need to start thinking from the end. So we need to start thinking from where we want to get to, and then try to work at what kinds of steps do we need to get there. And it really means we need to get away from incremental improvements, trying to sort of twitch existing structures to make them slightly better, towards really thinking, okay, if I want to have a sustainable system in place in the long term, what do I need to do now to get there? And that is really a fundamental change in compared to what we see happening at the moment. It's a bit, if I may use an example that's from a very different sphere, it's a bit like deciding to run a marathon. If you've never run before and you decide you want to run the marathon next year, that certainly provides you a goal and a framework that then forces you to really think about, okay, what does my training schedule need to be? How do I need to maybe change my food? What do I need to do to get there? And that's very different from an approach where you say, okay, maybe I'll do some running once a week and see how far I get and how much I can fit into my schedule, and then maybe I can run a marathon in 10 years. So that's the kind of difference that we want to see in policy making, really thinking from the end and trying to work out what needs to happen now to make it happen. And then the second recommendation is that we need to ensure the resilience of transport systems. So when we're looking at those longer term targets, and we're looking at restructuring our transport systems towards more sustainable and climate friendly systems, there will be a lot of changes that are going to happen. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that while we're making these changes, we keep in mind that the climate is changing. And irrespective of how much we manage to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there's a certain amount of climate change that is already locked in. And also, depending on how well we all manage to reduce emissions, there's a lot more to come. So, and transport infrastructure, we know, especially in many developing countries, but also in the developed world, is very susceptible to climate change impacts, and that can be either from slow onset impacts like rising sea levels, increased temperatures that affect your road surfaces, etc., to extreme events that just destroy infrastructure through floodings or storms or hurricanes. All that usually has huge impacts for the economy and the population, it disrupts your economy, and we need to start to better integrate those considerations in our transport planning at all levels. A lot of the transport planning obviously is not at the national level, but subnational, local levels, but national governments can do a lot to ensure that those considerations are actually taken into account at all levels and provide guidance and support and capacity building to all those levels where the planning actually takes place. So the third recommendation is around cities. We need our recommendations, maybe I forgot to say that, are really targeted towards national governments. So what can national governments do for the transition in the transport sector? So the third recommendation is that they need to empower cities through dedicated support. And what that means is that national governments can do a lot to help cities with their tasks, and a lot of cities are actually already embarking on that road and trying to work out more sustainable transport systems out of the many demands and challenges that they're facing in terms of congestion and air pollution, etc. But national governments can do a lot to support that, and it's partly financial support, but there is also many other ways of supporting cities through removing barriers, for example, in national regulation that maybe hinder cities in trying out new approaches or doing things differently. Also providing guidance and offering platforms for exchange, for example, between cities in the country. So there's a lot that national governments can do. Of course, the majority of the burden here still lies with the cities themselves. Then the fourth recommendation is about investing in sustainable rail, waterways, and multimodal hubs. What we need to see in a sustainable transport system is that the majority of goods and people are transported using highly efficient modes of transport, and that is usually rail-based transport and waterways where they are available. And to be able to do that, we need to work on the supply side. So if there is no rail available, if there is no ports and no water transport infrastructure available, then it cannot happen. And this is normally very much in the realm of national governments to provide this investment or the frameworks for this investment. And we need to really start massive investment in this infrastructure to be able to move away from trucks and individual cars and really get the masses to use more efficient modes of transport. This needs to go hand in hand with a phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. That sort of helps also the financing of the infrastructure investments. A lot of the money that is currently spent on fossil fuel subsidies that then very much supports individual transport and truck road-based freight transport should be sort of redirected into infrastructure investment for the more efficient modes. So then we have the fifth recommendation, which is very much linked to the fourth, which is about enhancing system efficiency in freight and logistics. Having the infrastructure in place is a prerequisite, basically, for this, because we need to have the possibility to move to more efficient modes. But what we're talking about here is really the overall system efficiency. So it's a mix between, we need to look at efficient vehicles and of course also low carbon fuels, but we need to look at the efficiency of the system. So we don't want, especially in freight, we have a lot of inefficiency, particularly with road freight transport, with empty trucks or only partially filled trucks, that we need to improve, and where we can really have gains both on the environmental side with reduced emissions, but also economically. It's just much more economic to have an efficient system where you have full trucks or full trains. That makes just in general much more sense. So for that we need the infrastructure, but we also need to have guidance and incentives from the governments to increase the competitiveness and the overall efficiency of the system. And then last but not least, we need to accelerate electrification with renewable energy. And it's important to think those two in parallel. Using electricity directly in vehicles is definitely the most efficient way to use renewables, to use renewable electricity. We of course also have other renewable fuel options, but they are limited and they do have their own issues with sustainability. So we can't just replace all fuel that we're using today with biofuels, because we just don't have the land resources to sustainably produce biofuels at that scale. So if we're using electricity and solar and wind power, then the most efficient way is to use it directly, because we have lots of losses when we're converting this into other fuels. Every country needs to see where it makes sense to start with electrification. In many cases, that is probably public fleets. It may be two-wheelers or three-wheelers in some countries. So you need to see where you start, and it can be it needs to be a gradual process. And also in parallel, you need to work on, of course, decarbonizing your electricity sector and electricity generation. Otherwise, it's not really working. We do have some issues in the freight sector where direct use of electricity is certainly possible for light duty vehicles and already happening. But for heavy duty vehicles, other options may be needed, especially electrofuels and possibly hydrogen. But there is still a lot of development happening, also in terms of directly electrifying heavy-duty trucks. The good thing about electrification is that it really has direct and very strong sustainable benefits in terms of reducing noise and pollution. But of course, if we just electrify all the vehicles that we have today and that are expected to be on the road tomorrow, we still have congested cities. So it all comes back that we need to, all those solutions need to work hand in hand towards a integrated system that looks at all the different elements. And thanks for listening, and you can find the publication.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting presentation. We've already received a couple of questions. We will save them for later for our Q&A session. And first, I would like to give the floor now to Mark Major from SlowCat.
Hello all. It's my pleasure on behalf of the SlowCat Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport to inform you about two important initiatives that are taking place this year that are linked to the obligation of all the countries that are parties to the UNFCCC's Paris Agreement to submit revised NDCs in 2020. So I'm going to talk about the database and analysis work, and I'm going to speak about the advocacy campaign. In 2020, as the NDCs are coming in, along with our partner GIZ, SlowCat, with the support of a number of other partners, will be building an online database which will include all the details of how transport is treated in NDCs. So this, as the NDCs come in during the year, the database will be completed. And this will be a resource to the whole transport community to understand what countries are saying, how they're including transport, and what their objectives are. The idea, this is a tool that you can use. It will be publicly available online to support your activities. Sorry, the slides change rather slowly. Okay, so the database will capture not only sort of general information about transport and the modes that are covered, but also specifically what are the targets, how does this link to a long-term vision that needs to be achieved. Importantly, it will cover like the integration elements, the governance aspects. Does it deal with finance? Are they working with stakeholders? And the specific measures that are proposed to mitigate transport emissions and respond and adapt the system to the challenge of a changing climate. So this will all be available online. And the database will include not only this kind of information about what is covered, but it will include the actual transport text from the NDCs. So you will find there, see if you're interested in what countries are saying, you don't need to be going through thousands and thousands of pages of NDCs. This database will provide you the text that is countries have submitted related to transport. So it will be directly available. So, sorry, I'm having trouble with the slide. Here we go. So we will also, by the end of the year or early 2021, be providing an analysis. Nadja mentioned at the beginning that SlowCat Partnership did this at the end of 2015 to inform COP21. And we're going to be doing this again at the end of this year, at the beginning of next year, to inform COP26. And this will give an analysis of how transport has been treated. Not only which ones have mentioned transport, but importantly, do they have a comprehensive approach to dealing with transport? Are they really dealing with all modes? Are they dealing with all the kind of actions that are necessary to achieve their target? And this will also enable us to compare the level of action now in 2020 to the level of action that was proposed in 2015. And this analysis, this work will also feed into the next version of our flagship Transport and Climate Change Global Status Report, which will also be coming out at the end of 2020 or the beginning of 2021. One of the important things I want to emphasize is that although this will be our analysis for our partnerships and our report, the database will be online, and it should be a tool to help many of you support your work. So if you're an organization that's working in country, maybe you can use the database to find examples, good examples for use in your in-country work. Maybe you're an organization that has a specific interest in one mode of transport. So you'd be able to use the database to find an overview. Okay, which countries are dealing with, inland waterborne transport, for example. So this should be a tool which can help you all in your work. The next thing I want to talk about is the NDC Transport Advocacy campaign, which we're kicking off today. This is the first time that this has been presented, and we're very happy to be doing this with many of our partners in the sustainable transport community. And the aim is to provide a campaign to increase interest and discussion about transport in NDCs and ultimately increase transport ambition in the NDCs. We're going to be providing online recommendations, so using social media in the next weeks and months. These will also promote tools and resources, we'll highlight examples that we're seeing, and we'll also give kind of indication as we go along as the number of NDCs build up, how many are covering transport, how many have got targets, etc. So like a running commentary on the overall picture. This has been developed building on the work that is done by others, including the broad policy analysis that GIZ did that Marion just presented, but also on the work of other SLOCAP members that are active in this field, particularly the work done by WRI and ITDP. So it will be a social media campaign in part in English and in Spanish. We'll also be outreaching directly to countries, the real actors in drafting these, sending them the information and communicating with them that addressing transport emissions is possible. And I guess this will also allow us to use some of the outcomes from the database analysis to inform on trends and progress as the year carries on. So here is the first view, first public view of the 10 policy recommendations that we're going to be making. And these are meant to be kind of pragmatic suggestions on how to have a comprehensive and meaningful approach to transport in NDCs. We've limited it to 10 to try and make it kind of digestible and understandable for all countries, regardless of their circumstances. And the next slide shows you an example. So the first message is about mitigation targets, and we're proposing that NDCs include specific transport sector carbon dioxide mitigation targets. So this is the kind of message that we'll be launching on social media, but also importantly, we'll be providing an explanation, we'll be providing examples and case studies and resources that can help countries draft these kind of elements of an NDC. Fourth message is about avoid, shift and improve. Marion also already mentioned this, but it's clear that only approximately half of the reductions we need can come from improving technologies, improving operations and improving fuels. We need this kind of broader transformation of access and how we move around. So avoiding unnecessary transport demand, maybe through shortening supply chains or shifting to more environmentally friendly modes of transport, maybe using public transport more. The other half of the reductions are approximately going to come from these avoid and shift strategies. So it's only with a package of these strategies that it's going to be possible to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Okay, another example is on finance and investment. The need that statements in NDCs and in transport plans need to be backed up by economic measures to support their implementation. And these are just kind of brief examples of what the campaign will contain. We would really encourage you to follow this campaign. The information has gone live on our website today, slowcat.net/NDCs. Please follow the campaign. On social media, you can also retweet, you can comment. We'd really encourage you to share these kind of information with your networks. This should be something which is an active and dynamic campaign through the year. Maybe you can provide comments and insights based on your perspective, what's happening with your mode or in your region with your work, to make this kind of a dynamic campaign. As I said, we've done this in partnership with GIZ, and it's been really our pleasure to kind of launch this campaign today. So thank you for your attention, and I pass it back to Nadja.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this very interesting presentation as well. Thank you to Mark and Marion both. Before we come to the Q&A session, I would just like to mention that we will make the presentations that we just saw and heard available to all of you later. We will send them around and possibly also put them up. As I said before, we've also already received a couple of questions. One participant addressed you, Marion. You said before that we need this holistic approach, and she says she's worried that if we forget the incremental steps, that nothing will be done at the end. Maybe you can comment on that. Also, she's asking how do you want to achieve all this, everything that you mentioned? She says massive capacity building support would be necessary, and funding for that is always difficult to find.
Yes, very good question. Thanks a lot for that. I totally agree that we need incremental steps as well, or we need to get started doing things. And that is also important to show that things work. But I think we also have many good examples already globally where things are working. So we have good practice examples that we can share and that people can learn from. So yes, absolutely, massive capacity building is needed. That is key, especially in many of the developing countries. There is massive lack of capacity and a massive need to learn from experiences that have already been made in other places. But we still feel that it's important to, at the same time, keep in mind that we do have a very ambitious end goal, and that you need to sometimes take a step back to see where do you want to be and whether you have ways to do things differently now that will dramatically impact your ability to achieve that. So incremental steps and activities are important. They're also often important as a bridge to sort of for the time that you need to implement maybe larger changes to already see progress and have progress. But that doesn't take away from the need to really look at the bigger picture, because it means that you may need to change your larger scale investments, and especially in transport, those larger scale investments on public transport, on road infrastructure, multimodal hubs, etc. All that takes a long time. So we need to start thinking about this now, and that doesn't take away from the fact that we need to look at those smaller steps and take those as well. And definitely we need to look at efficiency, for example, and I think that came in various parts of the recommendations, that we need to look at efficiency. But that's also something where a lot is already happening, and a lot of people are already thinking about efficiency and working on that, whereas some of those other more integrated views and approaches, that's what is still lacking, and that's why we're very much pointing to that.
Thank you very much, Marion. There is a question that kind of adds to that. A participant would like to know if there is any way of presenting or perceiving the recommendations in a more structured flow, given the limited resources in developing countries. So I'm guessing she's also asking for maybe a prioritization and what to begin with.
That is a difficult question, because that depends very much on the situation in the country and the starting point. So for some countries, that might be already quite advanced in thinking about cities, their priority would probably not be cities, but they might have a focus on either freight or electrification. I think certainly one of the priorities from our point of view would be the recommendations 1 and 2. Really think about the bigger picture and keep resilience and adaptation in mind when doing that, so that when you're looking at individual elements, that you have the bigger picture in mind. So if there is any prioritization, I would say it's on the first 2 recommendations, but it really depends on the situation of the country, and some countries have already started to think about the bigger picture, and then their priority might be electrification. So there's no universal answer to that question, I would say.
Thanks a lot, Marion. We have a lot of questions on COVID-19, actually. There is somebody asking what the impact of COVID-19 might be on the transport sector, and if maybe this not using transport at all could be a recommendation for a change of behavior. Maybe Mark, you can address that question.
Yeah, so reducing transport demand is the key part of the avoid strategies, and we certainly recommend this across all modes of polluting transport. If there's other ways of providing access while reducing transport demand, this is the key to decarbonisation. So this may be redesigning packaging so that you're transporting less packaging. It may be making supply chains shorter, so that the distance that goods have to move between steps in the production chain are shorter, or it may be urban design and incentives for local shops and services so that people have local access to goods and services. These are other ways of providing access. These improve access to goods and services while saving time and money and emissions. These are just good things. I think COVID-19 is giving us some insights into how important it is to have resilient access in times of crisis, that we need access to medicines, we need access to food and services, even during times of crisis, and ways to make these more resilient. So absolutely, thank you for the question, Matsuo, but absolutely avoiding transport demand by having access in other ways is a key part of this avoid strategy, which is an essential part of decarbonising transport.
Okay, that's thank you for the answer. That was regarding how COVID affects transport. Other participants would like to know how COVID-19 affects climate action and our activities overall, and maybe also the UNFCCC process and the NDC submissions and so on. Mark, maybe you can take up that one as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you will have seen many statements from political leaders, including the UN Secretary General, who is saying that despite the unprecedented crisis now, the short-term crisis, we must not lose focus on the long-term existential crisis, which is tackling climate change. Banks have said this, government leaders have said this, so this is clear that we need to maintain this focus on climate action. That's why we're carrying on with this webinar and our actions in the next weeks and months. Regarding the UNFCCC process, the UN process is very much based on physical meetings, and the two big physical meetings that were planned for 2020 have been postponed. So the summer session of the climate negotiations, which take place in Germany, were planned for June, have been postponed to October. And the big climate conference at the end of the year, COP26, which was to take place in the UK, has been postponed till 2021. So this does postpone the kind of actual negotiations and this kind of meeting point, but it doesn't change the legal obligations that are on parties to do things. So the legal obligations remain in force. So we're still expecting all the countries to submit revised NDCs in 2020. So they're still going to come in, they still have to prepare them. And so we saw real opportunity for that part of the work to carry on. We expect the COP26 to be rescheduled for 2021. So this is like a delay. And it's important that countries have chance to prepare for these meetings properly. So if countries are really focusing on the virus, it's true that they may not be doing the necessary preparation for these meetings. So maybe we will come to COP26 and maybe in the spring of 2021 with the countries better prepared than if they'd carried on this year. But we should see this as climate change is a 20 or 30 year challenge. We need to remain resilient and resolute in our working on this every day and every month. So not be distracted by these short-term distractions. We also see that the financial packages that are going to be used, that many countries are preparing now to re-stimulate the economy. This is a very important opportunity to invest in new solutions, new types of energies, new types of transport. So we're optimistic that these stimulus packages will actually give a boost to the kind of investments that we know are needed in transport and really pay off big time in the long term in terms of reduced costs and reduced emissions and improved access.
Thank you, Mark. That might actually already answer a question by Karim, who wanted to know how green financing would be affected by the pandemic. I think you already gave a great answer there. And other participants would like to know if there are any recommendations for how we can stimulate investment from the private sector and new financing options to support the sustainable infrastructure that we are proposing. Maybe Mario and Mark, I don't know who wants to take that one up. Or let me rephrase it, like how can we help the private sector, or what needs to be done so that the private sector can play a stronger role in the recommendations that we just gave, and how can we help increase the participation of the private sector in the financing options in this world after COVID-19?
I think in the recommendations we have this specific part about who needs to be involved, and I think that's very crucial. None of these recommendations can work without engaging with the broader community and all stakeholders that are involved, and that includes the government stakeholders at different levels, but it also explicitly includes the private sector and civil society. And I think if you bring them into the process and sit together with them in defining how you want to achieve the objectives that you're setting yourself, then you will automatically get to the discussions how the financing can work and what kinds of frameworks and incentives are needed from the public sector to trigger the private sector taking their investments in a way that you want them to. And that is very, very country specific as well. So I think it's really important to trigger those processes where you bring on board the private sector in the discussion about where do we want to go and how do we want to get, or how can we get there. And then you will have to find solutions that are working within the specific country context, but that really only works if you bring the private sector in on board very early in the process.
Okay, great. Thank you. Maybe Marion, can you give an example of how national governments can support cities in transforming the transport system? Because that is one of the recommendations that you mentioned.
Yeah, I think I already gave a couple of examples during the presentation, but I think we've also seen some good examples already being implemented. India, for example, has a couple of schemes that where the national government supported cities, the Smart Cities mission, the Atal mission, where they provide national funds, but also other support and regulatory support and guidance to cities. And I think a similar scheme was also implemented way back in China with the Transit Metropolis program, where the government supports cities, and India has, for example, conducted the Smart Cities Challenge, where cities can basically compete for funds with good ideas, and that automatically also then generates ideas that other cities might take up and start implementing. So that is one part, but I think also important is to really look at, are there any regulatory barriers that are existing at the national level that prevent cities from taking more enhanced action, and then removing these, and also providing platforms and opportunities for stakeholders and cities to interact and support each other. That's something that a national government can take the lead in connecting different cities and helping each other. So I think there's different ways national governments can support cities.
Okay, great. We have already reached the end of the webinar. There are still some open questions. We will try to answer them bilaterally, but you also, for everybody that is listening to this, not on the live stream, we will also be available to you via email. We have our email addresses in the slides, so if you have further questions or thoughts that you would like to share with us, please feel free to do so. We will also put up the recording, as I mentioned before, on our homepage and on our YouTube channel. It will have Spanish subtitles as well. So it just remains to me to thank Marion and Mark for presenting and Nicola for supporting us in the Q&A session. I'm very sorry for the questions that couldn't be answered now. The time is just too little. But I think already thanks to the presentations and the Q&A session, we all got maybe a better idea of what we can do to really ramp up climate ambition in transport. And then, yeah, I would also like to thank you, the participants, for joining us today. It was a pleasure having you. Thank you for the amazing questions and all the participation. Yeah, have a nice day. We'll send around the information and stay safe.